Perfect. All right, we are ready to go. We rock and rolling. Cool. Perfect. All right, y'all. So welcome back. We're gonna continue diving deep into the concepts of React that everybody needs to know. Again, for those of y'all who are just popping into this for the first time, or you just casually looking at this video sometime in the future, the things we're going over right now, we're talking all about React, everything you need to know, kind of just to get onboarded and start running with like Create React app and building your first couple React projects as developers. What we're following is the React docs, which are at reactjs.org. So if you're looking to figure out like more documentation on some of the concepts that I'm talking about, best place to do that is the React documentation. You can find a lot more information if you go into the docs and look at this main concepts sidebar here on the right-hand side. So far, we've talked a lot about a lot of different concepts, from React elements and how JSX as a markup language for JavaScript is formatted, and we use JSX as in JavaScript basically to define the user interface that we want to put render finally onto the screen. And so React uses this very funky markup language called JSX, which is kind of looks very similar to HTML, but at the end of the day, as we've seen in the last few sessions, is JavaScript, right? It allows us to do a lot of interesting things like insert JavaScript expressions, use if and else conditionals and logic there, use functions, all types of things that come out of the box with JavaScript, we're able to then use to interact with these this markup language called JSX. And yeah, so when it comes to why this is important with relationship to everything going on in the web, React attempts to make things easier by merging some of the concepts that you would normally need to use HTML separately for and JavaScript separately for into one space. And that's where our JavaScript knowledge comes back. We've talked about how to render our own elements and just using the JSX syntax and using specific tags to allow ourselves the opportunity to render different visual elements onto the DOM. We talked a little bit about how that is set up in the project. We continuously have been talking about this concept called components, which is what allows us to basically split the UI into different pieces, reusable pieces like it says here, and essentially separate the logic there into different files and into different like little objects that you can use. Almost think about it like little Lego pieces for your application. There's two different types of components. We've talked about functional components, which are defined with the function keyword or defined as arrow functions. And we also talked a little bit about class-based components, which are a little slightly different variation, but both class-based functions and functional components, both class-based components and functional components have one job. Their job is to return some JSX, basically defining what is it that the user is going to see if this particular component is rendered. So both of them are returning some JSX. Class-based components have a different kind of syntax. Functional components were meant to be very lightweight, so all they're responsible for is defining a function and returning the JSX, while class-based functions, as we'll see a little bit today, have some specific features built into them that make them a little bit easier to make them useful in certain settings, I'll say. Easier or not easier is kind of relative to the scenario. Components are useful in separating out the UI that we've been seeing. So when we are building when we're building elements out that get too long, sometimes becomes helpful to break them into components. And we talked also about how components, sometimes it might be helpful to have components receive data so that they can customize themselves and be a little bit more reusable. So in this example, we see a welcome component that they created that is expecting to receive some data called props.name. And just like we said before, elements in React are meant to be interactable with relationship to JavaScript. So we can add JavaScript here and there to make things a bit more, excuse me, to make things a bit more, just, I guess, sophisticated, because JavaScript allows us to do many different things as a programming language. So here we're expecting to pass some data called props.name and basically make this welcome component a little bit more reusable. So instead of having to make 3 different components with each a different name, we can make one component and pass name as almost like a variable that will get updated. And can be changed based on which component is being rendered. This concept is called props, and we've talked a little bit about it these last several sessions. Props are how we pass data between components. So if I want one component to receive some data, I have to use props. But also, if I want to basically pass data from one component to another component, which is slightly different variation of the same concept, I also have to use props. So if I want to give a component data, whether it's just I want to give it to it or I want another component to pass it to another component, I need to use props. That's the only way for those components to get data in that format. So as you can imagine, props are very useful, right? Because you can really make your components customizable and pass this data in different variations so that your component can use it. One other thing to mention about props is that props are passed. The only place where you can pass props is from within a parent component to the component you want to pass props to. So basically what I'm saying is whenever you're rendering a component, you'll define the component somewhere. So here is the definition of that welcome component. Typically, if this, was an actual project, we would see this in a different file. And this welcome component would essentially kind of live on its own, right? But when you put a component in a file, that doesn't necessarily mean that component is going to get used, right? To basically use a component after you've defined it, you need to render it. And the way we render elements is by calling that component with this JSX syntax that starts with an open and ends with a closing tag. With the capital letter referring to the component that we're trying to render. So wherever you are rendering a component outside of the app.js, which is our main component in Create React App, that place is really important when it comes to props, because wherever your subcomponent is getting rendered, that is the place where you can pass props. And where that takes place is in the relationship of the parent component to the child component. So in this example here, the app is passing data to our child and to the welcome component, which is the child of the app component. The idea is to keep track of okay, well, where is this component getting rendered if I want to pass it some props? And you can only really pass props from parent to child, right? So the app component is in a position to pass props to the welcome component. That's really important, and just important to keep in mind as you start working with props and wondering okay, well, I want to pass data from component 1 and component to component 2, but you need a component above them that has both component 1 and component 2 so that you can pass those props in a more effective way. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later today. So again, like I'm saying, most of what we're talking about are the main concepts in React. You can read through the React docs and get a lot of the sense here. This is where they're talking about how, see, this component is super long, but what if we actually broke it up into separate components, right? And then ultimately it would be a little bit easier to see it, easier to understand. But yeah, so recently we've been working on our own little application that is meant to kind of show us this example of like passing props and working with different components, breaking things down into more easy to understand pieces. And that's exactly this application that you see here, which is essentially just a simple document that has a nice heading and a table that we've been working with, this little table here. To take a look at the code then, I will start at the app.js just to kind of walk us through what we're seeing here. The app.js, remember, is the main component that renders in React, right? So this is the component that gets rendered first, and that component then renders other components. So if we take a look at our app.js, we're going to see some interesting stuff going on here. First of all, I like to look at what components are getting returned first. And so clearly we see that the app is going to be returning this heading like we see on the screen, and then our table, right? So that makes sense, right? Table in this case is a custom component that we created. We can tell that by the fact that it starts with a capital letter here. Most of the components, like whenever you create a new component, you're going to want to start it with a capital letter like this to differentiate it from any element that might have the same name. And we also know that this is a custom component because we're importing it here at the top, right, to use it. In addition to that, just like we were talking about, it looks like the table component is receiving some props, right? Some prop called data right now. And again, props are just variables almost that relate to objects of data that we can pass. So here we're calling this prop data. We could call this whatever we want, and we're passing a JavaScript object, some type of JavaScript object, whether it's, in this case, table data is an array of data. It's, in this case, it's an array of objects. And we talked a little bit about how we can pass different types of data as props. So here we're passing an array. We talked about how we could pass a string in props very simply. We talked about how we could pass a number as props very simply. We talked about how we could pass another object as props, right? By just kind of giving it something like this, right? Right, so, and we talked about arrays, right? Clearly this data is an array, but if I wanted to show you this and just kind of in place instead of it being a variable, right? This is a little empty array, right? And last but not least, you can also pass functions as prop. So I'll just call it func, right? So the syntax for passing props is the same. We use these outward curly braces to define a JavaScript, that this is a JavaScript expression, but then you can pass different elements. So here, if I wanted to put a function, I would just put a blank arrow function for now, right? Or I could just put console log. Right. So here's me defining a function. Well, this whole thing is the function, this arrow function, and passing that as a prop into the table, right? So that means if the table, if I was trying to return the data, table data, right? I could use data, props.data, and I'd get back this. If I use props.string, I'd get back this. Props.number would give me this. Props.object would give me this. Whoops. Props.array, props.func. And the whole idea of props is that once you define props when the component is rendering, that component can make use of those props, by calling it in and just kind of referencing it. In functional components, which we've talked a lot about, you call props by using the props, by putting the props keyword inside of the parentheses of your function. Then you can use props like a normal variable and take off any of the pieces of props that you care about in your functional component and use it as data. But also what we can do, let's just do real quick, console log props, and then we'll come back and talk about the rest of the table file. So I'll save both of these, even with all of these random, these super random other prop signifiers, and then kind of inspect the page after it reloads to take a look at the console. So clearly we kind of got this props object getting passed back, right? And we can see the array, we can see the data, which was another, the actual array we were using. We could see the function, right, passed as props. We could see the number and the other object as well as the string. So all of those data types you can use with props. Functions probably are the most interesting in that they have a specific reason. There's specific reasons why you might want to pass a function as props. And the behavior of this is also very interesting. And we might touch on this a little bit today as well. But cool. So props are really important for passing data from one component to the next, like I was saying. So clearly here in our app component, we have this data called table data, and we wanted to pass that into our table. So the idea was to use this prop table data as a basically to pass it as props so that the table could receive the data itself and use that data. We talked a little bit about tables from the HTML context. So I brought up to y'all that tables are a default element in HTML. And so we looked at the table tag reference, which talks about how tables are really easy to kind of use. There is a table element in HTML. So remember, that's why it was important for us to make this component with a capital T, because the lowercase t already refers to a JSX element that is built to function like this HTML table element. Tables have kind of like three types of data that come inside of it: the row, the data, and then there's like a couple of different like container elements, like the header, the body, and the footer that you can use as well. So the majority of tables, you'll see the table row and the table data. You'll also see a table header, because that's what defines kind of the table keys, I guess. But then sometimes when you're wrapping content, you might see people use the table head and the table body and the table footer, which is exactly kind of what we did. So we had started off with a very simple table, but then realized that the code for that table was a little bit difficult to continue to read. And I talked about like, well, if we were kind of continuing to add elements to it, it would get a little bit harder to use. So what we did was separate the table into two other pieces. We have the table header and we have the table body, right? The table header is just another component. This time we used an arrow component arrow function, to define this functional component very simply as just returning a table head with the row and the data for the table head inside of there. Then we made the table body component, which is also a really interesting component, because the table body is what eventually shows the data for our table. And what we worked on last session was making the table body a little bit more of a customizable, I would say customizable, what's the better word to use? A more kind of scalable, let's say that, solution. So rather than me list out all of the rows, so if you look at how table bodies, in terms of how table bodies work, right? So the table body is just a wrapping component that then wraps different table rows that have different table data. So as you can see here, if I was trying to do all of the months, right, it would be really a lot of different elements involved, right? So January, February, everything was a lot. So we saw that being the case in our code, and then decided to make the table body a little bit more sophisticated. And that's why we ended up passing the data into it from the app.js, where the data is props.data in this sense is referring to, well, first of all, this table is receiving props, right? So when we say props.data inside of this function, what we're talking about is, when we say props.data inside of this component, we're talking about the props.data that's defined by this data that we passed into the table. So remember, data here is defined as a prop for this component, table, the main table component. which is why in the main table component, when we call props, we can use props.data inside of it. But what we're doing is interesting. We're passing this data. We're not really using the props.data for the table component itself, but for the table body. So what we ended up doing was passing another prop called data down to the table body, right? You know, it might be a little confusing that we use the same name, but like I could very easily call this body data, right? And then inside of table body, you know, I could take props.body data and map through all of those things. So that's essentially what we were doing. Go ahead, bro. Give me 1 second to can you give me 1 second to finish this last point, and then I'll take your question. So essentially what's going on in this component is really interesting, right? Because you know, we didn't really talk too deep about arrays until last session, but one of the things that is really important to know about React and JSX is that list of elements, like if you have a list of JSX elements, it's very easy to render an array of elements, especially in a JSX context. So normally we might, with data that is going to be repetitive or show up a bunch of times, it's very common that we'll use what's called a mapping function to turn data, regular data, into JSX elements. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We have this array of data that is just an object that has a couple keys, month and savings. And those objects are essentially representing the data that we would eventually want to see in our table, right? And so what we did was we say, okay, let's pass this array into the table. We use props to do that. Pass that data from the table into the body, because the body is going to be responsible for visualizing this. So essentially, this funky line here is really might be something that's interesting for y'all. But what's going on here is props.data, remember, is referring to whatever data prop we passed into the table body, right? So that clearly is the props.data that came from the app.js into the main table. So we're taking that array. So this is that array. Props.data, if you are bearing with me, is that array of data that we saw in the app.js. The map is a specific array method that takes in a specific function that you want to run on all of the elements inside of an array, and it returns a new array. So the map function takes an existing array, goes through all of its elements, and it calls some function on each element. And then it returns the new array of all of those new elements that you've returned. So in this case, what we passed as a function was, we were like, hey, so for every element in this array, which we call data object, for every data object in the props.data array, right? So we're referring to all of these objects. For each of these objects in this array, what I want to do is return. So I want to return a new type of element that'll be inside of this array. And so what we did was we returned some JSX, right? So we just said, okay, cool. I want to make a table row for each of these data pieces. And each table row is going to have some data in it, right? Just like every table uses a row with data. So rather than, so basically what we used that array to do was create all of the table rows and datas that we would need based on the length of that array and the elements inside of it. So we have the row and we have the data for each of the rows that get created. And then last thing that we saw was, as we're mapping over data in JSX and returning it to be seen, it gave us a warning that said, oh, you need to make sure that you put a key in your list. Like, lists need to return a key. And so we basically, a key is just a unique identifier for each element of a list. And so because at the end of the day, we were rendering this rows array, we needed to make sure that it knew each unique element in that array. And so we just made a super simple key and passed the array index as the key. which is why in our function we did at first, we had the name for what we were going to call each element in props.data in this function. And then we can always pass a second parameter that is going to refer to the index of that particular object. So passing the index there to be a unique key. But we're really, what this function is doing is very elegantly taking every element from our original array and basically returning that element as a JSX element that we can eventually, in this big array of JSX elements, we can eventually render on the screen. So rather than in our table body, render all of these rows with data, row with data, right? We're rendering an array, right? We're rendering this array. So remember, when we see the curly braces in the elements, we know we're talking about JavaScript. So we're saying, hey, take this variable and render this inside of this return statement, right? And we know that rows is an array of all of these JSX elements. And so eventually, when that gets finally run and rendered, that's what creates this very dope list for us that allows us to make changes to the data inside of the app.js and have those changes reflect in our table, right? So I'm adding July here. And as I added in the app.js, we see that it comes back in the table. And the reason why is because the array doesn't care. This array that's mapping through all of this doesn't necessarily care how long the data is. It says, hey, for however long this data is, I'm going to go through and run this function, which is why this is a much more scalable solution than if I was just writing out all of these table rows, right? Because what if I asked you to write 100 rows? You'd be like, this is ridiculous, right? You'd probably throw your computer at me. But with using arrays, we can make that happen very easily. And that's why the map function, array function, is one of the most important functions to know in the React context. And a lot of that information, if you were trying to figure out where in the docs is that, it comes up in lists and keys, like I mentioned last class, where we talk a lot about arrays, we talk about the map function and how we use arrays commonly in React to take one type of data and return a new type of data. So we use this pretty often in the React-based context, especially with lists of data. And if you think about, most applications that y'all use today, there's a lot of data, lists of data that they're showing. So that's one way to visualize it without having to recreate a bunch of components. Because if you think about it, table row in and of itself is just a set of elements. We could make a separate component, like another, maybe table row component, like a custom table row component, and return that custom component instead of all of this too, which would be interesting and something worth trying to do for yourself if you want to do. But yeah, that's a little bit about all the code that we're working on last class. Go ahead. Somebody had a question earlier.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to see the constant table header. You already showed it to me right now.
Nope, no problem.
Thank you.
Dope. Okay. So that's a little recap of kind of where we are. Just off those vibes, can I get a quick React thumbs up if it makes sense? Or if anybody else has any questions, feel free. Dope. I'm seeing some thumbs. Go ahead.
And in this case, the way that you're defining those functions is just your preference, or is better to get used to this way?
So basically the way I'm defining these functions, I'm using arrow function syntax. Yeah, so this would be a much more of the modern way to define the functions. Either way will work, functions or arrow functions. I typically like to use arrow functions wherever I'm defining new functions. So I'll leave the app.js the same with the function that comes from Create React App. But when I make my own custom components, I'll normally use arrow functions. But
there is any advantage or difference? No.
Not necessarily with the functional components, but writing your functions as arrow components, writing your functional components as arrow. When you're working with functional components, so anything like this, there's not too much of a difference between the function and the like regular default function keyword and like an arrow function in that sense. But when you're working in general with JavaScript, and writing functions that will be a part of other things. So like an example like here, where in this props.data and mapping, I'm using this arrow function here. There are some advantages where you use arrow functions as regular functions within your within other JavaScript objects and contexts. So yes, there are some benefits, but not necessarily a different benefit from this being const table header like this, or this being like something like this. You know what I'm saying? The difference here is not as significant. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Nice. Cool. So yeah, that was a little review of kind of what we got to last session. And yeah, the nice little table-based app that we're seeing here. And so the whole idea is that, React tries to make our life simple by giving us the opportunity to create these components. Each component gets the opportunity to receive some props as data, receive some data as props, I should say, and pass that data or do something with that data significant, right? So in the case of this table, this is doing something significant in that it's receiving the props and it's passing it into its child component, the table body, because remember, I can only pass props from the parent. So the table body is a child of the main table component. It receives that props as data. It receives the data as props, excuse me. And then it's doing something super significant with that data. It's saying, hey, take this data and create all types of JSX elements based off that data and render that, finally render it, right? Because remember, the job of a functional component is to return some JSX. So here we're returning that rows, a variable that we create that's just an array that gets created with this props.data.map function that we got right there. Cool. So yeah, some super complicated and interesting stuff going on with regard to the props that we're seeing there. So nice. So now I want to kind of just continue this conversation to talk a little bit more about another kind of really important concept in using data when it comes to React. So we now know that if I want to pass data between a component to another component, I got to use props, right? That's pretty simple. If that makes sense to you, throw a thumb up so I know that makes sense to you. Props, yeah. So when I say props, you're like, oh yeah, we pass the data. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So now that we understand that, right, the whole point now is like, okay, well, that's one way of working with data. And another way that might happen in working with data that's different is what happens if a component itself, like inside of a component, what if that component is going to be changing data, right? So we know we can pass data to a component, but here's the thing about props that's important to remember. Props, once you pass props to a component, so once I tell this component prop called data is this data that I receive as a table cannot change. I can't edit props.data. I can only receive props.data. I can read it, but I can't write to this. I can't turn props.data to something else. It'll give me an error that says that I can't do that. So props are read only. You know what I mean? You can't change props. So that's good and bad, right? That's good in the sense that, that means whatever data you pass into your subcomponent or your child component is always going to be the same. If it refers to props.data, it's going to get this. But that means that inside of the table, right, we can't change the data in here. So if I wanted the data to change from this list, I could only change it from where the prop was defined. That's the only place I could change this. But inside of the place that received it, I can't change it. So props is immutable, right? It's immutable. It cannot be altered. It's almost like a constant value, right? So keep that in mind. But there's hella times where you need data that's going to change, and you need data that, and most times data is going to change inside of a component, right? Something's happening inside of the table and we want that to change and be reflected. Maybe you make an app that gives users an ability to add a row to the table after each item, right? Well, then after I add this next row, maybe I want to type August and put some value there, right? That would mean I would want to update this data in the table, right? So technically, I can't use props to do that. But today we're going to talk about how we can do that and just kind of continue to show some of the value of React and the core principles of how it works. So to do that, we're going to make use of a concept called state in React. And state is different than props in that we can use state to keep track of data inside of a component and update the data inside of that component over time. So let's show this in a more practical example and make our app even more useful so that we can show how this would work, right? So right now I have a form. I have a table, excuse me. The table is showing off this data that I want to see and some values associated with it. But what if I want to make this table a little bit more dynamic, right? Maybe I want to make this app a little bit more dynamic, and I want to make it so that the user can add to this table, right? So maybe like what I might want is at the bottom, like I said, maybe there's some like submission space for the user to like add values to the table, like and submit values to the table. So we talked about an HTML element that could do this piece of showing the data, and we talked about lists, we talked about tables, so now we know a lot about tables. But what's an element that we can use to do this process of inputting data and like submitting inputted data, right? If you think about your experience on the web, and you know, I don't know, I never thought to say this, but when it comes to building out your applications, you should think about the user interfaces that you're familiar with, right, on the web. Like what types of Jawns come up, like even just searching, even just kind of just scrolling through the W3 schools and taking a look, you know what I'm saying? Like what's going on in here? Or if I was on a different website, like the React website, like what are some of the elements that I see here, right? And one of the elements that probably is coming to mind as it relates to like your time on websites, right, is probably like a form, right? Like a form like thing. Like, oh, maybe if we had a little form here at the bottom, we could like take in some input and we could like return something that could maybe update this table. And just so you know, like, right, most times when you think about like some type of element that might exist, right, you got to kind of imagine if there was an element that would let us do forms, right? Well, in HTML, there probably is an element that lets you do that, right? And it's called the form element. The form element is the exact tag, HTML tag, that lets you create a form. Forms are a very important element when it comes to web apps, right? Because they're useful for so many different contexts. But just to kind of see it in action with an HTML, like just within HTML, here we see a simple HTML site with the HTML tag. So this is HTML. It's not JSX right now. This is HTML. But inside of this, we see an HTML form, right? The form clearly has an element called form. And inside, there are different other elements called inputs and other elements called labels, right? So each input looks like there's two inputs. And then inside of, well, there's three inputs, excuse me, and I'll talk about the three. And in the labels, there's two labels. So this form essentially has one label that says first name, and that's this one, this little label here, right? That label corresponds to this input that's next to it, that is a submission inbox, right? That lets the user type and then submit, right? And similarly, we have another label for the last name, as well as an input that corresponds to that. And finally, we have a last type of input that is a submission button. And that submit button is what actually processes our form, right? So forms are pretty interesting because you can input data, the user can input data, and then process that input to have something else happen on the web, right? So that's what makes them a very important HTML element. But clearly, they're a little complicated because they have a couple of different, not only do they have a couple different elements, but they also rely on a couple of different types of attributes. So we'll take it one piece at a time and just kind of create this little HTML form for ourselves. So each form tag in HTML is broken into a couple of different elements that you can use. You can use inputs for grabbing data. You can use text areas for like larger amounts of text that you want people to type that are multi-line. Buttons, if you want to add buttons to your form. Selects are like check boxes, radio selects, options. What are options in the oh yeah, so when you make a select also is like a drop down, I think too. That's where you can give it the various options that would show up, right? So there's all types of different elements that come back in forms that are really helpful. And yeah, so labels we talk about and all types of other stuff as well. We can read some of the attributes that come back from the form element here. But then each element itself, like we saw, kind of is full of different types of inputs and stuff that you can use. So here, if you scroll down on the W3 schools, it also talks about, oh, here's a form with checkboxes. Here's a form with radio buttons. So it gives us a little bit more of that, and it also even shows you a little bit of CSS that you might want to use. But cool. So let's create a very simple little HTML form to let's create a little simple HTML form for our React app to try to just make this application a little bit more user interactive. And we'll see in using the form, there will be a couple of new concepts that we're going to have to talk through in order to get it to work. So, let's just get ready to rumble. Got two monitors here. One second, y'all. So we're going to jump back to the code. And let's talk about how we're going to structure this out. So right now we have in our app.js kind of just like the heading and the table. So next, let's maybe just add to this app.js a new element that'll be kind of like our form, right? So I'm just going to pretend like I have a custom component for the form right now. And I'm just going to kind of position it like this. Matter of fact, for the sake of making the I'm thinking while I'm speaking, which is like that's my toxic trait, is to is to think and speak at the same time. So let's just talk about how we'll make the form first, and then we'll figure out where we might want to put it. I just want to do that first. So let's just make a new component. So I'll make a new file in this components folder. I'm gonna call it form.js, and the entire point of the of this form will be to render some HTML form, right? And so just like we saw before, I'm gonna just make a super simple arrow functional component. So I'm gonna call it const form, set it to an arrow, right? And then all this has to do is return some JSX. So I'll just return simple kind of form, right? And this would be enough, right? But because this is in its own file and I might want to use it somewhere else, I'm just going to export default form so we can take this form element that we have and return it into our files. So cool. So I'll save this and I will basically let's just think about what might be kind of how we might want, right now this is an empty form. So let's just think about like some simple stuff we can add into it and just kind of get familiar with the way in which forms work in general with regards to with regards to HTML turning into React JSX. So so I'm just gonna open this parens up a little bit and just extend this a little bit to be a couple lines long. Cool. So inside of this form, right? It might be important for us to have a couple of spaces for us to add the values that we might want from this table, right? So we might want to be able to input a month, and we might want to be able to input some data here. So just like we saw with the HTML, right? We could do that pretty simple, probably with like the label and the inputs. So let's just kind of add a label and an input into our form, right? So I'm just going to say label, and let's say month, and then let's do an input, and then we'll talk a little bit about the attributes of the input in a second. And then let's do another label called amount. Oops, my fault. And then we'll talk about the input there as well. So cool. So now we kind of have this little form-like element. Not sure if just having these inputs blank for now is going to cause an error, but let's just see if things return right. So inside of the app, I'm gonna add to this table, just add to this app.js, a reference to our form. So I'm just gonna import form from, and then here inside of these components, just gonna return our little form. And let's see if something pops up on our screen here. And cool, we do. We get a nice little form, got the month, got the amount, and then maybe what the other thing I might want to add is like little submit button or some kind, right? Like something in the form to allow for us to submit, right? And so inside of the elements for forms, right, we see that there's different types of inputs. Input itself is its own element, but you can see that the type changes. The type is either text or the type is submit here. And that's what actually turns different types of, that's what creates the different types of form inputs for yourself. So there's inputs for checkboxes, there is inputs for radio buttons, there's input for just plain text in the sense of like a regular text input. And there's inputs for all types of stuff, right? So here's a big list of the different types of inputs you can use in a form. Buttons and checkboxes, you can do email, password, right? Text, all types of stuff, numbers, radios, all those things, right? So in this case, for month, we probably want just text or input type equals text. And same for this input for the amount. That we can put here as well. And so inside of the app, we should be able to add, you know, just type and interact with these different elements, right? And just kind of add right into the inputs. Cool. And so the last thing we would probably need is some type of a way to submit this information, right? And so another type of input you can use is type submit, which would allow you to create a button that would appear next to your form. And when this button gets clicked, technically your form will process and something unique will happen. So this is a pretty interesting kind of setup, right? We have our table, we have our data here that we might be collecting, and we might want to submit this data so that this data updates our table, right? But if we think about this, how might this happen? Like what might make this work, right? Because technically the data from the form is its own data, and this data from this, the data from the form is its own, right? But then the data from the table is its own, right? And like we said, well, the only way for us to really pass data from a component to a component is using props. But we also just said, well, the data that is stored as props can't really change, right? So how might we actually go about updating data that we want to change and then make sure that it can be passed in a way, in a format that other components can change, right? This is a typical scenario that comes up when you start working with React components. I have one component doing something specific, and then I have another component doing something specific, and I want one of the things this component is doing to influence this other component. I know I can pass props from a component to another component, but how would I update the data that's inside of the props, because props doesn't really update, right? So this is a common scenario that you're going to come across as a web developer building out these applications. And the answer to this conundrum is you would use what we call state in a very unique way. State is a data, is basically data that can be stored that a component can internally change, right? So let's take a pause on this application for now and just talk a little bit more about state so you can see what I mean. And we can then imagine how this might be helpful and maybe revisit this, this really interesting application on Thursday sometime. So now we're going to just kind of just take a real quick little detour and talk about, well, how might I create some setup of data that is going to change, right? So I'm going to make a new component. And I'm going to call this, let's say, I'm going to just call this state example.js, right? And so what we're going to do here is we're going to build out a new component. And this component is going to be a pretty simple component, but we're going to talk about how state works with regards to components and how we might use state in different ways in React. So I'm going to just start out with, I want a component, right? So basically what I want this component to eventually return is super simple div. And inside of that div, we're going to have a number. So we'll start with 1, right? But also what I want this component to be able to do is basically, I'm going to want to increment this number, right? So it says 1 here, but I want to be able to update this number over time. So maybe I'm also going to just add a button in here. And the button, let me just make a button and I'm going to say add to, I'll just say +1, right? And close the button, right? So this is kind of what I want this component to return. So let's just talk about, let's set up this component for real, and kind of talk about the different ways for us to work with, to make this kind of possible inside of this component. So for now, because we haven't talked about it in a while, I'm going to actually make this a class-based component, because class-based components actually have some really interesting use cases when it comes to doing something like this and using state. So remember, class-based components are a little bit different than functional components and how they're declared. So first thing you need to do to write a class is import React from React. So we need to import the React package from the React library. And then the first line of class would be class, the name of the function or the name of the component. So in this case, let's just say add1. I'm gonna just call this class add1 for now. And we're gonna say extends react.component. And then open some curly braces around this. And then the only difference between big difference between a class-based component and a functional component is that before you return, you need to call a specific function called render around the return. So render is a function that classes have to define, and then the render function is what returns to the actual JSX. So just the two more steps to add into making our thing work. And so then last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just export the class, export default add one. So cool. So I'm gonna just rename this from state example to add one, since I'm using that as a name now, so that it's not confusing. Save this, and now I can export and import it. So I'm gonna go back into the app, and just for right now, I'm going to I'm just going to kind of take a pause and just kind of redefine the app.js so that it will show us this add one stuff and not all of this other stuff with the table. So we can still see it, but we won't have this kind of interrupting us. So first thing I'm going to do is just kind of comment out the old app.js. I'm going to just import the app.css that I wanted to use, just so I have some styles to make use of. I'm going to import the add one component from /components/add one, and then I'm just going to redefine the app function. So I could do function app like that, but just because I'm already showing y'all that we don't need to do it that way, I'm just going to do const app, make a new little arrow function to define the app.js. Cool. So this is still the same. All I got to do is return the JSX that I want to see, and then make sure that at the bottom, I still am exporting this so that it can eventually get rendered. And so the app has, isn't doing anything too crazy for now. So I'll just put a div, and I'll just make our add one component come back. And so this will just make sure that our app updates, so that what we're looking at is not the what's it called, the old app.js, but this new one. And clearly we got some issues here with just relationship to the fact that this component is just a little too simple. So I'm just going to add some other elements in here to kind of make it a little bit easier. Let's update the number. And then I'll just cool. So this is a little easier to see. We got a nice little header message, and then we have this +1 button. So you can probably imagine what I'm trying to do here with this component, right? I want this button to eventually increment this number 1, right? And so this is a good example of, we have a component that's doing something, and we might want some data inside of this component, because right now we're inside of this component. We might want some data inside of this to change, to update, right? It's not like we're passing the data anywhere. That's not what's happening. We're just trying to increment and update the data over time, right? And so basically, we don't really know a good way to do that right now, right? Maybe, you might be thinking, well, okay, like if I know this is JavaScript, maybe I might want a variable, right? For like the number, maybe I want some variable called number or something. And since this is JavaScript, right? Let number equal 1, right? And maybe instead of 1, right, I could do number, and then maybe there's some way for us to make this button update this number, right? And so in that sense, like you might be thinking like, okay, well, is there a way for us to kind of get this number to update? And you're part of the way there, right? So let's even continue with that logic, right? And use this function. So, or use this variable, right? So we have a button, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but we're going to get into this soon. What happens when we're starting to work with elements that the user needs to interact with, right? A button, for instance, is something that a user will click on. And when a user clicks on something, something else should happen. Well, that's another concept that we're going to break down right now, is how do we process events in JavaScript? If you remember when we made our tic-tac-toe game, when we did it with regular HTML and CSS and JavaScript, we talked a lot about how in JavaScript, part of the responsibility JavaScript has is processing events that happen on the HTML DOM, right? And so we talked about how we can basically, whenever something happens, there's events that get triggered, right? So when this button's getting clicked, there's an event that could be triggered. When this screen is getting clicked or something's getting dragged, there's events that can be triggered. And every time you're working with HTML elements, you're going to want to be able to reference those events and then, you know, update things over time with JavaScript and HTML, right? And one of the beautiful things about React is that it actually makes that process very easy for us to update things based on events that are happening. I just want to point out that a lot of this concepts, because I'll probably have to go through this pretty fast, is covered in the handling events section of the main concepts in JSX, right? So here, even here, we could also just take a look, right? We see a button. Buttons have a specific attribute that you can use in HTML. So if we went to the HTML reference of a button, you'll see that working with buttons isn't too hard. You just define the button, and then you can define the text. And then inside of a button, you're able to then use some of the attributes in here to change things on the style and stuff and the attributes of the button, but also buttons have specific events that you can reference as well. And I think, let me see if it goes in this and talks about it. Oh, maybe not. So there's a lot of different HTML-like events that cause JavaScript to be called and can run JavaScript, right? One of the ones that probably, you know, you're thinking, well, what happens when you are messing with buttons? You know, the action really is a click. We call it a click. So inside of these elements and these events in HTML, we'll see one of the types of mouse events is on click. That's a specific HTML event that gets triggered whenever something's being clicked on. In React, we also can make use of some of those HTML attributes that are built in. So when you're looking at new tags and looking at new, like it's a great idea to look at the HTML reference for different tags, different events, different things that you want to have happen on your web app. But the thing about React is there's always a slight difference. It's not always as simple as copy paste the HTML, right? Because as you can see here in the HTML, we have the onClick attribute that can take a function and call a JavaScript function. But in React, it's slightly different, right? Instead of it being lowercase like this, it's camel case, and you pass a function by using the JavaScript curly braces, and you put the name of the function, right? So this is how you kind of start defining event handlers in JavaScript, right? So it's a little bit more like you might remember from our tic-tac-toe, it was a lot more complicated and a little bit more steps than this, because now in order to have this work, you needed an HTML document, you needed like to have your JavaScript somewhere, you needed this function defined and all of that. But with React, everything's inside of one file. So we have our button, right? And in order to make this button do something unique, I might want to define something to happen when the button gets clicked on, right? And so here I want to define a particular function that will get called whenever the button gets clicked. Sometimes you'll see people define that function in line. So like if I just kind of put an empty arrow function here, I could put like a little, I could almost put some stuff in here as well. So I'll just console log clicked for now. And then we'll go ahead and just refactor this to be a little bit more easy to see, right? So now go back to the screen, go to the console, and then click the button, and boom, it's telling me that it's gotten clicked. So great. So we now know that this button is wired up and running a function, right? So you might be thinking like before, like, okay, well, what happens if, you know, so we know if we see this H1 is let's update the number, and the number is here, and we have a number as a variable. So what would happen if we said, okay, on click number gets number plus 1, right? And so let's see what happens now. Well, I'm clicking it, right? And nothing's happening. Well, what's going on here, right? What's happening that's like messing this up here? Well, the thing is, even though actually, Yeah. So I'm clicking this and nothing happened. This is from before. I was kind of blown. I was like, wait, what is this? But clicking this and nothing's happening. That was what I expected, you know? So why is that happening this way, right? 9 times out of 10 as a developer, you always ask yourself, why is this happening this way? Why is this not happening this way, right? So what's crazy about this is this goes into a really important concept that we're gonna need to learn about, which is called component life cycles in React. I think they probably have some doc on this somewhere. Yeah, it's conveniently in the state and life cycle concept, which I'm trying to talk about right now. But there's actually a decent diagram that I want to see that will make talking about this a little bit easier. Yes, sir. Is this in the docs? Let me see. API reference. All right, for the sake of time, we'll just use whatever one of these Jawns. All right, cool. So components have follow a specific life cycle, which is basically the process of what happens when you define your component to like your component being shown on the screen, right? So there's a phase of your component life cycle where the component is just getting created. It gets rendered on the screen, and finally it gets shown up. But the thing about React and how this is very interesting to know about components, this diagram we'll come back to a couple times. But the idea is once a component gets rendered, it doesn't get re-rendered unless something specifically tells it to re-render. This is a very important concept to understand about React, is that components do not render themselves more than once unless something changes the component and makes it update itself, right? Most times a component will just kind of get created, render, and then show up. And then it won't update unless something triggers it to update. The three things that allow a component to update are that component receives some new props. So another component passes that component some new props that will make our component update. If the component state, which we haven't talked about, but we will in a second, gets changed, then the component will update, right? Or if we use a function called force update, which we don't really use in the work that we're doing because it's not necessarily the best practice. So if we really want our component to update, right? If, like in this case, I want this to update. And I literally have the word update here. This is terrible if I roll this out into Silicon Valley and I'm the laughing stock of all the VCs because my app's not updating. You know what I'm saying? Where's my unicorn status now if I don't get this app to update, right? I'm basically like every other company promising the world and not delivering. But jokes aside, like we want this to update, but React won't, by nature of how the React library works, it will not update this component after it's first created. And it becomes important for us to update that component either by those two of the three ways, by giving it some new props or by introducing a concept called state that will allow our component to update. Tell our component, hey, I'm changing some data and you should update so we can see that change. And that's why state is very important. Now, one of the reasons why I'm showing you this thing in this like crazy diagram is because the component lifecycle method happens with every component, but it's very easy to work with when you use class-based components. Even this diagram right now is structured around a class-based component. It has this thing called constructor. We just talked about the render function and how that renders what we see. So all of these functions you see defined here in blue and whatnot and even some of the ones in green, we can make use of with classes. So there's with functional components, we can also do some of this stuff, but it's a little bit different. And so I want to show you it in relationship to this life cycle stuff, because the point of this is we can't re-render this because of how component life cycles work. And so it's important to use state to update the life cycle of the component and thereby go from, we finished mounting it the first time, now we're updating it, right? And if we ever were deleting a component or something changes on our app and a component goes away, that's called unmounting. These are three kind of terms you might hear as you're starting your journey, getting deeper into React. But updating the component, right? We might want to use state. So let's talk about how we add state to a class-based component. And technically, it's not too complicated. State is basically data that will live internal to the component. And so in order to add state to a class component, I'm gonna just do it real quick and then we can talk about it, right? We're gonna make use of one other component lifecycle method that classes can just use, and that's called a constructor. Constructor functions are basically like you would expect them to be in any other kind of programming language, right? When you think of a constructor, you probably think this is the function that will run first, the initializing type function, right? That's exactly what this constructor is doing. The React component, so React.component is basically talking about a default component that is like our parent class, right? And we're inheriting by extending this. We're basically saying we're taking what's in the React component main kind of template, and then changing the constructor, changing this render function, overriding those, and like doing our own thing. So a constructor function in the React class runs first, and it gives us an opportunity to do some interesting things data-wise, right? So first thing that's important to know is that when you are working with a class-based component, the way that you deal with the data inside of a class is a little bit different, which we talked about a couple of sessions ago. So one thing that happens in class constructors, when you define a constructor, it's best practice to just call props, kind of like, call props, and then just run the function super on the props, which basically just initializes the parent class with the props as well, so it can make use of you can make use of the props the right way in your application, in your class-based component. So that's just something you'll see people do inside of their classes. But what we're talking about here is state. So the other benefit of using a class-based component is just state is built into classes by default. So you can create a state inside of a class-based component very simply by saying this dot state and setting it equal to an object, a JavaScript object. State in React is always going to refer to an object. The state object is essentially an object that can store key values like any other JavaScript object, but the key values that are stored in state can be updated by the component at any point in time in its in just how it's being rendered, right? So one of the things that's important about state is that you use key value pairs. Like I said, it's an object. So I want this object to have a key called number, right? And I'm gonna set it at 1 to start, right? And the idea would be that this number is going to be what updates over time, right? You might be seeing this like this dot state. You might be wondering like, well, what is this dot state thing, right? Well, state is the value. This is referring to whatever instance of the component add one or that we're looking at, right? So there could be multiple add ones out in the wild somewhere. And we're saying by using the this keyword, we're specifically referencing whatever instance of the class is at that particular, is calling this, right? So that kind of just differentiates those different values. So just if you think about this is kind of like a default constructor as you might see it in a class. You see the constructor, you see the props, you see the super props to initialize those, and then you would see this dot state if they were using state in the class, and some values for state. If I wanted multiple values, I'd separate them with a comma, give that a key, give that a value, or I should say key 2, right? Same thing if I wanted another one, key 3, right? So this is an object, and objects use key values in JavaScript. So, all I really care about is the number, right? So I'm going to save this. And You know, nothing really has changed on this side. But on the other hand, what we're trying to see here now is how can we now make a reference to this state, right? And so in class-based components, you can make a reference to both state and props by using the this keyword as well. So inside of this component, inside this class-based component, right? If wherever I want to use props, I'll just write this here. Classes use the this keyword to refer to state and props. So if I want to refer to state, right? Maybe I don't want to set number as to this empty value. Maybe I want it to reference the value here, right? You know, but because number is going to get a little confusing, I'm just going to delete it from here for now. And instead of using the number here, right, that we had as a regular variable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap this with this dot state dot number. And essentially what I'm saying with this, right, is go to the state of the component, grab that number that is stored as a key in the state, and let's use that number, right? And so just to show you that this is going to change, I'm just going to make the number something super big for now. And then we're going to see, why did this component? Oh, wait, my bad. Oh, that's because of this. I'm going to make this empty for now. Cool. Okay, bet. So we see that this number updated. So it's no longer that number one that was down there. It's definitely coming back from this dot state, right? So this dot state dot number is what I mean when I say classes use the this keyword to refer to state. If I wanted to get number, so say number was being passed in to the app, right? So say like we're talking about with props, right? Maybe I was passing number and say number here is 23 or something a little bit more specific, right? If I wanted to get props in a class-based component, I use the this keyword as well. So instead of it being props.number, I could swap this to say this dot props.number, and that would refer to the number that was passed in as props. So just showing you the kind of difference between state and props, one, and then two, right? The fact that classes use a different kind of syntax than functional components, in that you have to use the this keyword before you call props or before you call state. And if before you call functions that are also defined inside of the class, which we'll see in a second. But we just talked real briefly about props, right? Remember, props get passed into the function, and then you can make use of them by using props.number, in this case, this.props.number. But we don't care about the data passed outside of the component. Because remember, props don't change. We can't change props. But with state, right? The whole point of this is with state, we are going to be able to change this data. So I'm going to put this back to the number one so that it starts back how we want it to start. And then inside of the button now, right, I can do something somewhat similar to what I was attempting to do before, right? I want to say, maybe I'll say let number get this dot state dot number. So it's going to get the old, it's going to get the state, the number inside of the state, and it's going to set that to a variable. Then what I want to do is I'm going to say number gets number plus one, right? Makes sense. I'm just going to add one every time this gets clicked. And now here's what I have to do that I wasn't doing before. I want to set the state to change from this old number to the new number, right? And so in order to do that, right, I'm going to have to make use of a function we didn't talk about because we didn't have access to it before. But now that we're using a class-based component, I can use a function that's built into a class called set state. This, and I got to call it with this dot set state, like this. With classes, you're probably going to need to use the this keyword before state, props, and any other functions you create. But in this case, I got this dot set state, which is a function that is built into classes, right? This function, all it needs to do is take in some new data, right, as in the form of an object, because state is an object. Remember, we just talked about that. So what this dot set state does, it says, okay, tell me what the new object is that you want to put in state. I can put new parameters in here, and I can update existing parameters. So what I want to do is I want to change number. So I know that the key in the state is called number, right? And I want to update that number with this number, right? But this is going to look a little kind of crazy that, okay, I'm referencing this number, but you see it here, right? So it kind of is getting a little confusing. One thing I can do, I could definitely change this variable to be something like num or something. Num gets num plus 1, and then do something like that. But another thing that is kind of cool about JavaScript and the new ES6 kind of JavaScript stuff is if I did have, let's say I did want to call this number as well, right? And I want to make reference to an object in the state that's called, or like just an object that has a key also called number, but the value is called number as a variable. One thing that ES6 lets us do to just make this simpler is just say number. So this is basically saying, take the number key and pass this number value as data. And but because I don't want this to confuse y'all too much, I'm just gonna call it new number. just make it straight up, so it's not as hard to see. So I would say number gets new number, right? And hopefully that makes sense. Thumbs up if that makes more sense. We'll see all these other funky JavaScript things over time. But basically, let me close this too. So basically what we're doing is whenever the button gets clicked, we're taking the state, getting the number from the state. We're saying, hey, we're going to update that variable that we just got that is technically the old state, right? And then we're setting the state to be something new, right? By swapping that number for the new number. Now, saving this, right? Nothing changes first because of the fact that we start at 1. But now I can plus and continue to click and continue to add and update this component because this value is the state. This state can be updated. And because the state is tied to the React lifecycle update, right? Whenever we set state, whenever I call that set state function, I'm telling my component to update. That's what allows this component to eventually re-render, right? So we see it renders once, and then only when the updates happen does the component ever get re-rendered again, right? And so that's kind of how the state works with regards to React. So we can use this state to keep track of all types of stuff, numbers. I can keep track of. This is an object. This is a JavaScript object, so I can use any type of data here. Numbers. I could have a string. I could have an array. I can have an array. I can have an array of objects. You know what I'm saying? I can have whatever I want. I can have another object, you know what I'm saying, with keys and values, you know what I'm saying? I can also have a function in here too. Just like props can take all the different type of JavaScript data, so can state. But the valuable thing about the state is that you can update it from inside of the component. And this is really important because this is the only way for a component to get the logic it needs to become dynamic in this sense, right? This component is responsible for changing its own data, which is really a powerful concept, but something that will open us up to the possibilities of React in a number of different contexts. And so, yeah, I know I'm a little bit out of time. So Thursday, what I'm going to do is talk more about state when it relates to how we can kind of see state reflected in a different sense. But then also, we're going to keep kind of diving deep into this concept a little bit more. One thing I feel like if I end it though, it's kind of going to be a little OD. So feel free to drop if you have to, but I'm going to just talk about one more thing. It might take 5 more minutes, if you can stick around for a little longer. But if you can't, totally understand, deuces. If you can, this is going to be pretty interesting, and I'll touch back on it on next session. But I want to show you, because we talked about a class-based component, right? And how classes can use state and all of this, right? But I do want to show you the other way that people in React are going to be referencing state, because it's going to come up. If you start looking up things online, you're going to be like, well, Professor Cam showed us classes, but they're using this other thing. So I want to show you this other means of using, basically defining your state in React. And this is for functional components, right? So class-based components are great because they have a lot of this stuff built into them and it makes them very simple to use. But sometimes you'll see people doing similar things with a functional component. So I'm just going to comment out the class-based component right now. And let's pretend I was just starting this out again, but instead of using a class-based component, I wanted to use a functional component, right? So by nature of how we know about functions, I'll even use the old function syntax because this doesn't matter. Function or arrow function doesn't matter. But if I had add one, right, as a new function, and I open it up, and remember, all this function needs to do is return. So I'm just going to open that div. Matter of fact, I'm going to just copy the return from down here. So let me just copy this. Save y'all some time for those of y'all sticking by, because you know I love y'all, appreciate y'all. And then I want to uncomment this out. That's going to be important. Cool. So I got the div. We need to, I don't know what's going on here, bro. Div. Let me close this. Okay. Oh, I got two returns. That's what it is. Dope. Okay. Cool. So got the function and it's returning this nice little div, same thing, right? But functional components are different than classes in that functional components don't have state built in. You can't use this.state with functional components. That's not how it works. And that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure that y'all get to see real quick is how this works for functional components, because it really is an important kind of distinction here. So in a with like a functional component, like the thing is that you're going to need to bring in another package from the React library in order to manage state from a functional component. And so the way that you do that is you're going to use a concept called hooks in React. So what you'll see is instead of bringing in the React library by itself, you'll see people bring in the React library and add this like kind of curly brace with something like this inside of it called use state. Here, basically what we're saying is we're going to bring in both the React package, and I want to also bring in a very specific part of the React package as well. So when you see the curly brace and then something inside of it, it's saying inside of this package that I'm exporting. So remember when we export things, like when we export the form, right? This export means that whenever I import, I'm going to bring in whatever we exported. So by nature of how the imports work, it's going to bring back like the big thing, right? But sometimes you want a specific library from there, a specific function from inside of that big package. And you don't want the whole package. And so that's why you see people use this curly brace with the with whatever they're going to use. So use state is a specific what we call hook in React that you can use to add to your functional components to essentially give them the ability to use state. I'm sorry, it sounds so redundant, but that's why they called it this. And hooks are new in React, right? So I definitely really wanted to show you this because once you start looking things up, people are going to be using hooks. You're going to be like, why did a professor teach me classes and not hooks? But I want you to see both now, and then we'll talk about which are easier, better to use. You can choose based on what works for you. But since hooks are pretty simple to use, but they're different in that, you know, with a class, like we saw, it's kind of already built in. You know, once we start using a class, you can use this.state out the box. You make your component, make your state, blah, blah, blah. And then you can use this.state and you can use this.set state, right? That's how state works. With hooks give you that same functionality, but you have to add it into your functional component. It's kind of the trade-off of using a function versus a class-based component. So if I want to add a state hook to this add one component, what I'm going to do is at the top of the component, before I return, I'm I'm going to create a new hook. And so here I'm going to just declare a new state variable. So basically, I'm going to create a new hook for the number, right? So the number, right? Remember the state holds values. So this is another difference between state in a class-based component and state in a hook. In a class-based component, I can make the state have as many different variables as I want, like I was showing y'all. But with a hook, I can only do one variable at a time. So it's not as wasteful. But at the end of the day, could be a little bit more complicated depending on how you look at it. So here I have the number, right? And then with the hook, you define the value that you want to call, like this is the state variable you could think of. And then you need to define the corresponding function that will be called to update this particular variable. So we normally see a pattern in using hooks. That's the name of the variable, and then another variable with the word set right before the name of the variable. So number, and then you see something like set number as like how the hook gets defined. And then you use the use state function, basically, that you're bringing in from the React library. And inside of this function, you pass the value that is going to be the default value, like the starting value of that particular state variable. So here I'm going to pass 0 to say, basically, this number is going to start at 0. And then whenever I call set number, I'm able to update the number. Then we can kind of just go back to our original kind of work that we did with the class-based component version of this. And we can say, okay, change basically this to say, let new number, instead of saying this.state.number, it gets a little bit more like treats this like a variable. So this is just going to say this new number gets number. We're just going to refer to this, right? We're still doing the new number gets new number plus 1. But then instead of the this.setState, we're just going to call that function we created called set number, right? Which is a function that's going to update But instead of passing an object, we're just going to pass the new number, right? So it kind of models itself just like this. We just pass whatever the value is going to be. So we take that number and we have set number, and then we can update this functional component with the state as well. So now next thing I got to do is just make sure that I export add one at the bottom. But now we're exporting our functional version of this, our functional component version of this versus our class-based component of it. Why does no want to show up? Export default add one, function add one. Oh, let's update this number. Make sure this shows up the right way. Okay, but that was what it was. Cool. So we have our message starts at 0, and then as we increment, we're getting the same system happening, right? Where now this component is re-rendering because it is now some state is being updated. But as we can see, hooks are interesting because look, this is kind of still a pretty lightweight functional component. We have the ability to use state, and we're using it in this kind of interesting, with this interesting function from React. But the trade-off is that even with a functional component using hooks, you still need to import something, still got to do some really kind of interesting configuration, right? So then the question that you got to ask yourself is like, is it easier to just use the functional components and use a bunch of hooks, or would it be easier to use the class-based version of this, right? And just have like all your state in one place, and so you can just edit that way, right? I'll let that be something you decide. If you're still here and you want to just drop it in chat, which one you think is easiest, that'd actually be something I'm interested to know. But I wanted to make sure that y'all left today knowing that there's 2 ways to use the state, whether it's a functional in the functional component way or the class-based component way. So yeah, let me know in the comments in the chat if you like which way seemed easier, whether it was a class-based way or the functional way, or whether you say both are confusing. That's cool to understand too. And take care. I appreciate y'all for getting through this really interesting lesson on how we can update data inside of components in React.